the plan of the week is basically the first couple of days are on internal matters to the communion, sort of stuff amongst ourselves, and the next 2.5 days are on external matters. So we've been basically looking at inward-looking things over the last couple of days. We talked about the nature of what are called the instruments of communion, the Consultative Council, the Lambeth Conference, the Primates Meeting, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. What powers they have and what powers they don't have. We've had lengthy discussions about that. We've talked about the Scottish Episcopal Church's decision on same-sex marriage. We've talked about, what else have we talked about? My mind's gone completely blank. Oh yes, we talked about money, how we pay, how we pay for the instruments of communion. And we talked about the Lambeth Conference at some length. We had 2 reflections from the Primates Task Group, which was set up in January 2016 to look at what it means, what walking together means, and what it doesn't mean. And we listened and debated that really most of yesterday afternoon. And yesterday morning was entirely a morning of silence and prayer and retreat and reflection in the cathedral. And so the whole of yesterday morning was prayer.
And what conclusions did you come to on the Scottish Episcopal Church?
We looked at that both just before lunch and just after lunch today. And there were a lot of expressions of disappointment, I think fair to say. Strong feelings from many of the provinces. That was heard very carefully by Bishop Mark Strange, the Primus of the Scottish Episcopal Church, who was careful to explain what they'd done and careful in expressing his recognition that this was going to lead to consequences in terms of not being able to play a role in ecumenical or leadership roles within the Scottish Episcopal, within the Anglican Communion for the Scottish Episcopal Church. And that was in line with the decisions reached in January 2016, and there will be no difference to what was decided then.
So have you actually decided to that the Scottish Episcopal Church should face consequences as the Americans did?
Bishop Mark said in his opening presentation he expected that to happen and accepted that it would.
Has a decision been taken to...
Well, it's left in my hands to follow that through, and it will be followed through as I did after the Primates Meeting of January 2016. We didn't take a formal vote, there was no need for one. And it's not a meeting where you very often vote. Last time was unusual.
I wanted to ask you, Dr. Idowu-Fearon, about something that you said last year. You talked about there being a very strong minority conservatives in America who were basically, you implied, sort of manipulating people in Africa. I put this to somebody from ACNA who we received a briefing from this afternoon, and he said it was absolutely a biblical issue, that it wasn't coming from North America, it was coming from Africa. I just wondered whether that was still your feeling, that actually people were being manipulated from Nigeria and other places in Africa.
I have not seen anything to the contrary, and so I still maintain the statement I made.
Did you get any sense of the reaction? Sorry. It's Olivia, Olivia Rodgard from the Daily Telegraph.
Thank you, Olivia. It's just that not everyone down here would know who you were.
Sure, Olivia from the Telegraph. Did you get any sense of the reaction from some of the other primates to, you said it wasn't like a formal decision, but that's what will now happen. Was everyone happy with that, or did you?
There was a consensus around that.
Okay. Has anyone suggested anything
else?
No.
That's Kaya Burgess from the Times newspaper. Was there was it discussed? I know that some primates were concerned that the consequences against the Episcopal Church supposedly weren't fully kind of put into
Yes,
practice.
actually, thank you. That was raised yesterday, and I went through what we've done, and they were satisfied, as I think I can show very clearly, that everything that was decided that could be carried out was carried out. I think one of the confusions that arose was that there were two confusions. One was that the Episcopal Church, TEC, as they're often called for short, was at the Anglican Consultative Council meeting in Lusaka last year. And, of course, the ACC is a trust under English law. They are members of that trust. In fact, one of them at the time, though he stepped down, was a trustee. And therefore, I have no power to overrule English law and say they can't come. And so that was explained. I think that hadn't been fully understood. And the second one was asking why the presiding Bishop of TEC, Michael Curry, was on the task group that's looking at walking together. And when you look at the wording of what was decided last time, it was perfectly clear that there needed to be a conversation and dialogue about what it was meant. And you clearly can't have a conversation if you've only got one group in the room. So we needed to have someone there. So that was said, and talking to people round over dinner last night and since, there's been no disagreement with that.
Gavin Drake from the Anglican Communion news service. On the subject of Michael Curry, it was mentioned at the press conference that was held earlier that he, inviting him to lead prayers at the start of Evensong last night, painted a picture of primates walking together when they're not necessarily doing so. Where would you respond to that?
Well, slightly taken aback. Let me get my thoughts together. It was Michael Curry, as the citizen of the United States, who's one of the primates, was asked by us after we talked with anguish about the events in Las Vegas. We said, could you lead a prayer as we begin our prayers together at Evensong? I mean, people all over the world are praying for Las Vegas. I don't think we ought to bring church politics into Las Vegas. I mean, it's the most horrendous, dreadful, appalling event. And I suppose I'd be surprised and disappointed by that comment.
Archbishop, Martin Bashir from BBC News. I wondered if you could, you just said that there were some strong feelings from many provinces during the discussion. I wonder if you could share with us your feelings about the decision of the Scottish Episcopal Church and how you felt today and will feel as you move forward in, I don't know, writing to them and expressing your own, whatever the measures are that you institute. How do you feel about that?
Very sad. We talked about things this afternoon of huge importance. We listened to a long presentation from one of the primates for his own protection. I can't tell you where he comes from a country where he is and his church is systematically persecuted. To look after him, to support him, we need to be united. So anything that diminishes that is really sad. And I don't think there was a lot of strong feelings, but they weren't feelings of people were disappointed, they were angry, but it was a very different mood to many previous Primates meetings. It was more of a family that's having to face the fact that something's happened that is causing grief than a sort of, club that doesn't like one of its members. And we were quite clear, people were very clear about how disappointed they were. But I think the mood in the room was, and how I will feel, is just grieved that one has to do things that no one likes, that I don't particularly like doing. It's you want people to be united, joyful, celebrating together. I mean, I'd really be interested in, perhaps Philip, what your comment is, because I was sitting at the front and trying to chair the thing, and I may have missed things in doing so. You were observing.
Pull the microphone towards you. I come from Australia, and we've just had our General Synod, and in an unprecedented way, responding to the Scottish Episcopal Church's decision, there was a motion that was carried at our General Synod, which was expressing concern about that and saying how that step of, as we understood at the time, of changing the understanding of marriage does impair the communion we have. Now that was something that there'd be strong views about in my country, because we're going through at the moment public survey sponsored by the government to guide our legislators whether they will change the Commonwealth Marriage Act to permit same-sex marriage. So there was a lot of energy in our country around this as a topical issue, but it was fairly unprecedented, I think, for our General Synod to express that concern. Now, I think so. I can resonate with the concern that others expressed in the room, because I think there is a strong consensus in the middle, as I've affirmed in Australia, that the doctrine of the Anglican Church concerning marriage is clear. It's determined by our historical formularies, by our prayer book, and it is about the lifelong marriage of male and female persons together under God. So that's a clear perception that we have, and it was one that Bishop Mark, the Primus of Scotland, confirmed remains in the doctrine of the Scottish Episcopal Church. So we've, I think we've got a strong centre in the Anglican Communion, which is supporting an unchanged position on the doctrine of marriage. But we also know across the Communion we represent places where, in some cases, homosexuality is unlawful. It can be punished by harsh sentences sanctioned by the state, to other communities where it's already been legislated. Same-sex relationships have an equal status in law with heterosexual relationships. So we're as a church family spanning the different operation of conceptions about human sexuality and seeking to make some sense of it and keep the cohesion of our community strong, whilst recognising these are not simple matters at all to do. So it is challenging, but I think at the centre there is the strong consensus that the doctrine of marriage in the Anglican Communion is both clear and unchanged.
Archbishop Justin, just if I may, just one more question. As you know, Bishop Stanley Mtagali of Uganda has said, how can we walk together if we're walking in different directions? You talked about the pain, personal and of other primates today in the experience of discussions and yesterday. What do you feel, though, about the pain that many feel that those who are proposing to accept same-sex marriage are breaching the authority of the Scriptures and are ignoring the truth of the Word of God as they would put it? And how do you feel about the pain that they feel?
Well, that's the pain I was talking about. The people who expressed themselves today were speaking from exactly that line. That's what they were expressing.
What were they expressing?
What you just said.
Well, what were they saying in the meeting today to you?
They were saying that this was contrary to the scriptures, that it was a tear in the fabric of the communion, that it made walking together much more difficult. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I'm trying not either to exaggerate or understate. All the things that you were just mentioning that Archbishop Stanley had said, they would agree with. And you know, a number of people said that, quite a number of people said that. Discussion lasted half an hour, 40 minutes, something around there. More than that,
Yeah,
was it?
more than that.
It felt longer. I was trying not to exaggerate. What, 50 minutes, an hour?
Yeah,
An hour.
Harry Farley from Christian Today. Dr. Idowu-Fearon, you just going back to Madeleine's question about your comments about the strong minority of Conservatives. 3 primates have chosen not to attend this meeting for reasons of conscience. Do you think that that decision was as a result of that pressure that you spoke about?
I wouldn't say yes. However, I would want to add that there are amongst the primates present here who feel the same, but because of the agreement, the decision arrived at last year, January, they decided to honor that decision, which was corporately taken, and they are here. I think being here is a sign of sacrifice to feel the pain the other side is feeling, and that's what I would expect of all the primates.
Archbishop Justin, just on that.
Harriet from the Guardian.
Sorry, Harriet Sherriff from the Guardian. Just on that question, you said that the mood today was different to previous occasions, January 2016. Do you attribute that to the absence of 3 primates who have been very vocal? Has the absence of those 3 primates made the discussions and the mood more cohesive? Has it been calmer?
It has not. Nobody expressed themselves less sorry, that's a really unclear sentence. Let me start again. The people who expressed themselves this afternoon expressed themselves as forcefully as could have been done by the 3 who were sadly not with us today. So no, I think the communion has, continues with profound struggles, but we recognise that, as Archbishop Philip was saying, we recognise that we come from 165 countries, more than 2,000 languages in the communion, and cultures, really huge range of views and opinions on an enormous number of things. And I think that if they had been there, we would have had the same experience of people listening carefully and attentively. It's just been a good meeting.
You said in your interview in GQ that the different views on sexuality were irreconcilable. That was the word that you used.
Yeah.
Do you not therefore see that actually a split is inevitable? My track record on accurate forecasts of the future is extremely poor. Irreconcilable, yes. We are dealing with 2 views, well, several, far more than 2 actually, which there isn't a common position. And that's a fact, and it's no use pretending it isn't. Does it mean a split's inevitable? There's one theological sense in which a split is impossible. That so long as we belong to Christ, we are members of Christ's family. And we are the children of God,
brothers and sisters with Christ. We cannot walk away from that any more than I can walk away from my sister or my children. They'd still remain my children or my sister. But in terms of organisational difference, certainly not inevitable. Easy, certainly not either. But then there's an awful lot of things. One of the most striking comments this afternoon was from one of the primates, who's a very good historian, saying, you know, we've faced this sort of thing many times before. Now, that doesn't mean it won't result in a split this time. It already has in parts of the community. But here we are, and we go on, and most of this meeting is going to be about issues like migration, like terrorism and persecution and war and reconciliation and prayer and evangelism and mission, and trafficking and climate change and more prayer. You know, that's what most of what we're doing is. We are not quite as fixated, perhaps, as we used to be. I don't know. I may well be completely wrong on that. I usually am on most things.
But I'll perhaps add a word.
I'd be delighted because I'm digging myself into a hole.
I think we had a very powerful intervention that was really about the confidence we could have. In the room, there are two of our primates who their heritage is totally influenced by the Atlantic slave trade. And they said that there was a long period of time when an even more serious question, a fundamental question about even humanity itself and the value of humanity, was tolerated within the church. I mean, as we look back now, awfully wicked in my country, similar issues with the dispossession of indigenous people in many parts around the world, that in a sense these things are properly ones that should sit under God's judgment, but God did not abandon the Anglican Church. We were able, even being immersed in things which were, as we now know, patently wrong, the cause for proper and deep repentance and restoration, that even then God didn't abandon the church when we failed so profoundly. Now, in our current situation, there's a question of whether we are failing in compassion to LGBTQI people. There's a question of whether we are failing in being sufficiently loyal to Christian doctrine and its practice and what the Bible teaches. These are the tensions we're in. But I think that the optimism we have, which is shared, is that God has not abandoned the Anglican Communion. And I think being here, present, as a foreigner from your country, here in this place, which is in many senses the heart of the story of Anglicanism and its greatness and its failings, is a very strengthening point of reflection. So I think that the primates, most of whom now, in a way, strangely enough, are far from English. I mean, I've got a German surname. Primate of Canada has a German surname. We have all sorts of origins which are not English. There is still something that we're seeking to understand. What's the glue that binds us together? Not just a cultural nostalgia about being a British diaspora. And I think as we seek to find that's where we find an optimism and a courage and a hope, because we know that it is in our Christian faith in Christ who promises not to abandon us. So even if we feel we're likely to abandon each other, we know that Christ won't abandon us.
Just if I can pass the microphone for a moment to another member of the British diaspora, Archbishop Kwong from Hong Kong. I think he would like to add something. I think this one is a better microphone.
Well, this is my fifth Primates meeting. The first one I attended was 10 years ago, 2007, in Tanzania. The issue of sexuality was on the agenda for all the previous Primates meetings I attended. I'm not going to tell you more in detail, but in responding to your question about the atmosphere, the mood of the discussion that we had this afternoon on that issue, I can tell you, the expressions were much more forceful in the past. And also, 10 years ago, people began to say that, well, the community is going to split, it's going to fall apart. But I can tell you, being a primate for 10 years and have attended the last 5 Primates meetings, I'm not a prophet, but I from what I experience, these last two, in fact, this last 2 Primates meetings, including this one, that I experienced, instead of falling apart, it seems to me we are walking much closer than before. I'm not saying that we have no arguments, no conflicts, as His Grace has just told us, but the mood and the atmosphere is very different from the previous one. I think basically is we in the Primates present acknowledge the pain and also the anger expressed over the issue, but we are committed, even though there are differences. We are we are committed to walking together, even though it is difficult.
We've probably got time for maybe one more.
I think we've got a
quick question.
We're okay.
Harriet, I think you're handing it. Please say, for the sake of the tape, please can you still keep saying your name, where you're from?
Harriet Shearer at The Guardian. So this is on a slightly different subject.
Oh, good.
I don't think it's that good. I'm sure you're aware that on Friday there's going to be a protest here in Canterbury by survivors of sexual abuse in the church and their supporters. They say that the comments that you made that were broadcast at the weekend have been grist to their mill. They say that they're very, very angry with what you said, and I don't think it needs repeating here. If you could turn the clock back, would you still say that again?
We have one of the things I said in that interview that was not broadcast was that one of the surprises for me in this role has been the extent. When I came in 5 years ago, 4.5, almost 5, I was not aware of the extent of the legacy of abuse. And the amount that we have tried to do is enormous. I mean, for instance, on the inquiry that's going on, the national inquiry, the ICSA, I in fact wrote to the Home Secretary, the then Home Secretary, now Prime Minister, some months before the public inquiry, both calling for a public inquiry in response to discussions with survivors and seeing the need for it, and also offering or urging that the Church of England should be one of the first to be up there in front of the inquiry. I feel that the Church, and it's widely accepted in the Church, that we have a long history of significant failure. We should be held, and I said this in the interview, I think it wasn't broadcast, we should be held to a higher standard because we came to be Christians. We're a church. But it's also clear that that the issue of abuse of children and vulnerable adults goes right through our society. Almost all our major national institutions have failed in that regard. Now, as I say, we should be at a higher standard. and my profound sense of shame at what the Church has done remains and is central to my thinking about this. I may have not put it very well, but what I'm trying to say is that none of us, especially the churches, and my goodness, we have a long way to go from where we came from, but I think there's been progress in current terms. None of us can ever afford to say, well, we've done that. That's behind us. I mean, Philip has had to deal with it in Australia, and actually I've been seeking, as he knows, we've talked about it quite regularly on the phone, getting his advice. The Australian Church has done a lot of work on this. And so I think with the survivors I would say, well, we know that we did wrong. We're trying as hard as we can to get things right. And my own enormous, profound, I mean, it's more than anything else that I wake in the night thinking of what was done to people and our failure to respond to it properly. So that's where all that comes from. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that's where I'm coming from at the moment.
Harry Farley from Christian Today. Archbishop, you spent the first 2 years of your tenure as Archbishop visiting to all different provinces around the world, and the 3 who aren't here signed the agreement in January 2016 to walk together. Do you feel betrayed?
Oh, no. No. That's never crossed my mind.
Okay.
You know, it's life, isn't it? It's they don't owe me anything that they could betray. You know, I'm disappointed. I'm sad that they're not with us. Really sad. But betrayed. Good heavens, no. That sounds a bit dramatic.
Does anybody else have maybe one final question?
Olivia from the Telegraph. You said when you were speaking earlier about how you felt that the atmosphere had improved and things had got better. Do any of you have any sense as to why that might be? If there's any particular reason why things might have changed in that time?
I'm trying to pass. This is a buck I'm trying to pass. I'll answer at the end.
Yeah, well, I think it comes from the profound honesty of examining our own hearts and realising that while perhaps a superficial approach is that there's a high moral ground you can struggle to occupy, that in a way that we all need to embrace the central truth of our Christian faith, that we're all sinners in need of God's restoration and under whose judgment we live and stand, and that quite contrary to any evidence or compelling reason of our human nature, that God still seeks us out in his Son Jesus and calls us into fellowship with him. So I think we've made a more intentional journey into that as a group of people. There was a long period of time when we hadn't met together, and I think that the opportunity that Archbishop Justin had in visiting people in their own place, sharing time in their households, praying with them, has been a very powerful one to actually move things more from the head into the heart. So I think that as a group of people, we are more engaged at the level of the heart, which is why the absence of some from our midst is profoundly sad, because you only forge those things that I'm talking about by actually sharing pain together, disappointment, and recognising that maybe we've all got some share. The old saying that every time you have a finger pointing, there's 4 fingers pointing back at you. There's this whole kind of thing of how we've examined that. And I think that's been positive. I think the fact that we've started each of the meetings we've had last year and this year with a time of reflection and a time of quietness in a holy place like Canterbury Cathedral has been quite formative. We're soon to go off to worship. This is not just a routine or ritual to us, it's actually a living part of the expression of our faith in the morning and the evening, and I think that has shaped the tone of our conversation and time together.
I think Philip put it beautifully. I mean, my more banal answer would be I think it's prayer. Lots of people praying. And, you know, that at the end of all things, whatever happens to the Church or the Anglican Communion, Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. And as long as that is true, because that is true, we have hope, whatever happens. And we remain deeply embedded in that sense of the risen Christ who rescues us. And for me, in this very peculiar role, I mess up continually and come back continually as a sinner to Christ, seeking forgiveness and renewal.